Ready? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Judith Ann Walker. I'm the Executive Director of the Development Research and Project Center, a non-governmental organization based in Abuja, Nigeria. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on a critical and important issue of insecurity, livelihoods, and welfare in northern Nigeria. This webinar is on the study that was conducted over a year ago and is being released for discussion, feedback, and conversations today. The webinar speaks to a very critical and important issue, and the study was conducted by the IDS, the CPAN of IDS. It was conducted also in conjunction with SPRiNG project, both of which are supported by FCDO. And for this, we appreciate and recognize the support of FCDO in supporting this particularly important study. It is my pleasure to welcome several committed individuals, stakeholders in the space of security, livelihoods, and welfare in Nigeria. Particularly, we have the Honorable Minister of Humanitarian Affairs, who will be speaking to us this morning on the important and coordinated issue of humanitarian affairs and poverty reduction. For the Honorable Minister, in all his work that he has undertaken since being appointed, he has focused on a joint and coordinated response to humanitarian affairs and poverty reduction. And for that, we are very excited because his position aligns closely with the findings of our study. It is my pleasure now to welcome the Honorable Minister, His Excellency, Dr. Bernard Doro, to give us the opening remarks on this important issue of humanitarian issues as it affects livelihood, insecurity, and welfare, particularly in northern Nigeria. Thank you very much. Honorable Minister, Your Excellency, over to you.
Thank you so much, and good morning to all participants. I bring you greetings from Addis Ababa, where I am joining several other ministers in charge of social protection across the world to look at evidence from the implementation of the productive safety net program in Ethiopia. I'm glad to be here. Distinguished guests, colleagues, partners, welcome to today's session. We gather at a very critical moment for our national development and humanitarian architecture. And the evidence from the SPRiNG program's research across Borno, Benue, and Jigawa speaks to the urgency of the moment. For years, our approach to supporting the most vulnerable has been undermined by a fundamental weakness. And that weakness is that of fragmentation. We operate isolated registries, duplicated efforts, and a systemic failure in which a household might receive several food aids from one agency and cash transfers from another, yet remain trapped in poverty. The problem has never been that of support. It has never been that support fails. It has been that the support fails to reach the intended recipients. It is that our systems were never designed also to move them from survival to self-reliance. The findings from SPRiNG program's research make the cause of fragmentation concrete, with 56.2% of our population below the national poverty line, and claiming over 11,000 lives in 2024 alone. We are confronting a poverty conflict nexus that runs in both directions. Conflict deepens poverty by destroying livelihoods and markets, while poverty, particularly youth unemployment and limited opportunity, creates the very conditions that fuel recruitment into armed conflicts. Three-quarters of last year's conflict fatalities were concentrated in 4 states. This is not a humanitarian challenge alone, or a development challenge running on separate tracks. It is one challenge demanding a full response. This is precisely why I'm leading the design of one humanitarian, one poverty response system, the OHOPRS. To break the fragmented status quo, OHOPRS is not another standalone social project. It is a national operating system, a unified architecture that harmonizes humanitarian action, social action, and long-term development into a single framework built on 3 principles: one system, one register, and one pathway. As we examine the implications of these systems today, 4 shifts stand out, each reinforced by what the current research tells us. In humanitarian response, we move from passive charity, and donor dependency to active sovereign coordination, anchoring operations within the OHOPRS and drawing on data from the Poverty Intelligence Lab ensures that relief is precise, transparent, and tied to a long-term plan. The evidence is clear that relief alone is not enough. Sustained escape from poverty is only plausible when security improvements are bundled with way. Actually, don't is how I will then register. Today's findings reinforce wide context. In building resilience, we recognize that dignity cannot be delivered in a temporary. OHOPRS ensures assistance is tied to structural graduation pathways that combine cash transfers with skills, credit, and market access, so that shocks no longer mean a relapse into poverty. The research is unambiguous on this point. Livelihood diversification is the single most consistent resilience factor across every conflict-affected context studied. And completion of lower secondary education is the strongest predictor of resilience after household assets. Yes, these protective effects do not reach everyone equally. Women-headed and youth-headed households are systematically locked out of education's benefits by structural barriers in land access, networks, labor markets. And this is what one humanitarian, one poverty response system aims to close. The gap needs to be closed, to ensure that we can benefit from all the interventions that have been on offer. In poverty reduction, we shift our measure of success from inputs, how much was distributed, to outcomes, how many households have exited multidimensional poverty. I'm not to manage poverty, but to end it ultimately. These frameworks demand a whole of government, whole of society response. It calls on our ministries, subnational actors, and international partners, including the researchers and development partners joining us today, to align under one logic of accountability and shared commitment. Let today's session map exactly how our respective operations and the evidence before us integrate into the OHOPRS architecture, turning macroeconomic achievements into dignified sustainable livelihoods for millions of citizens. Thank you so much. And I look forward to very constructive discussions today and a conclusion that will help us to further our discussions in our reforms. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister. We are particularly heartened that you drew so deeply from the research findings to reinforce your position, your philosophy, mission, and approach in the ministry currently. Thank you very much, and we appreciate your time. And we also note that the forum where you are in Addis Ababa right now is also considering the importance of research findings, and data, which is particularly important in this particularly important area and field. Thank you again. We will now like to move on. Thank you so much again, sir. We'd now like to move on to ask Dr. Okowa from the SPRiNG project, Strengthening Peace and Resilience in Nigeria, to give us a few remarks on the
Good morning, Honorable Minister, Executive Director, dRPC, CPAN colleagues, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I want to start by congratulating CPAN, IDS, and dRPC for the successful conclusion of this study on insecurity, livelihoods, and welfare in northern Nigeria, particularly drawing data.
Use the research. I did use the research to prepare the.
Sorry, am I being heard, please?
Thank you. Just which we are taking care of. You are being heard. Okay, thank you. Yes, apologies.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you. So, drawing from, from states in the Northwest, the Northeast, and the North Central regions, as SPRiNG, the Strengthen Peace and Resilience in Nigeria program, an initiative of the UK FCDO, we are pleased to be associated with this research and its findings and recommendations. SPRiNG draws its interventions on evidence of what are the drivers of violence and what opportunities exist to address those drivers, and also to promote resilience of population to the shocks and the pressures of climate change. So that is why we, as a program, we are happy to support this initiative, knowing that the findings were really going to be critical in influencing policy and practice on some of the drivers of violence in the target locations where the program intervenes. Across the different areas in the country today, we know that there is a clear link between lack of livelihoods, lack of social welfare, poverty, and related inequalities to instability. Whether it be young people or women, access to livelihoods is critical in terms of whether or not they are able to cope, whether or not they are able to resist pressures for enlistment into non-state armed groups, into criminal activities. This research is taking place at a time that the government of Nigeria is exploring opportunities for improving social protection policies. And we hope that the findings and recommendations, as the Honorable Minister has eloquently described, would fit into that process. Let me end by saying that this is not just the only intervention that SPRiNG is committed to, particularly in terms of relationships with the ministry. We would be happy to engage further in the area of technical assistance and also to share findings of another study, political economy study that has also been commissioned that would be of relevance to the policy-making process of the ministry. So once again, IDS, dRPC, and CPAN, thank you very much for this collaboration. And also, Honorable Minister, thank you for this opportunity. And we look forward to having a very, very fruitful and rewarding conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Okoa. And may I say, and may I offer to be a conduit to facilitate more sharing of new research findings to the Office of the Honorable Minister, because we have a very good working relationship, and we are sure that this is something that would be of interest to them. So we look forward to learning more about the research that has just been commissioned and to ensuring that there's a line of communication to disseminate more findings. Thank you. We'd now like to call...
Thank you, Dr. Ann.
Thank you. Yes, well done. We'd like to call on Alhaji Abba Waziri to speak to us a little bit about what the Office of the SSA to the President on Chieftaincy Matters is concerned about with regard to crisis, insurgency, and the anticipation of conflict around the 2027 election, and how they are positioning traditional and religious leaders to mitigate some of the anticipated conflict that is anticipated. Would you kindly share with us the work of the office and talk to us a bit more about what you are thinking of in respect of research and in respect of training and capacity building action for traditional leaders? Thank you so much. Alhaji Abba Waziri. So maybe what we do is move on to the next stage of the program. And the next stage of the program is of particular importance. And this is the stage of the program and the segment where we actually present the findings. We have shared a PowerPoint presentation and we have shared the actual study report of 43 pages. We're hoping that you would have, all the participants today on the webinar may have had the time to go through the actual document. But very importantly, we have with us our co-pilot, our guide, and our research associate, Vidya. And Vidya is going to talk us through the research findings. And I must say one thing about Vidya. Her knowledge and depth and commitment to research in Nigeria is particularly outstanding. We've had several experiences working with several partners over the years, and the dRPC has had a delightful experience collaborating with Vidya. And we are happy to invite her to share the findings of this research. Thank you so much. Vidya, over to you.
Thank you so much, Judith, and the sentiments are completely reciprocal partnership. And I think the long collaboration that we've had over the years has really enabled us to start to make inroads into the poverty reduction and humanitarian landscape in the country. So it's been a delight working together. As Judith Ann introduced, my name is Vidya Walker. I'm a senior research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies and deputy director of the Chronic Poverty Advisory Network. What I'm presenting today, as noted, is a collaboration between dRPC, IDS under the Chronic Poverty Network umbrella. So Honorable Minister, distinguished colleagues, the study that I'll be summarizing, its intent was to strengthen the understanding that we have of the links between different types of regional insecurity, between livelihoods in different regions and welfare outcomes in the geopolitical zones of the North, so in northern Nigeria. And if we think about the context in Nigeria, it's one of relatively high poverty in terms of monetary poverty rates and multidimensional poverty rates. It's one of high numbers of conflict fatalities. Much of this the Honorable Minister has overviewed as well, so it makes our presentation much easier to reinforce these components. The maps at the bottom of this slide point to some of the regional variations in monetary and multidimensional poverty and also in food insecurity. And a key takeaway from these maps is that you see these darker colors, in other words, more intense rates of poverty and food insecurity, especially within some states in the north. And in terms of the three northern zones as well, we see quite a bit of variation in conflict fatalities. So over time, especially in some states, for example, in the Northwest, increasing fatalities in recent years, high fatalities over time really in the Northeast and so forth. And there's also some existing evidence on bidirectional relationships. So conflict having an effect on GDP and on poverty in the country, but also limited livelihood opportunities fueling grievances, a nexus of insecurity with geopolitical mining operations and political elites recruiting in some cases and organizing violence as well. So the relationship is certainly bidirectional. In this presentation, I'll focus relatively more on the first relationship from conflict to poverty and the ways in which then certain types of livelihoods or assets that households are able to develop can help offset or moderate that relationship so that conflict does not need to have such negative, depressing effects on poverty. So how can we come out of this vicious cycle? So it's with that in mind that the research set out. So there was a desire to understand the relationship between insecurity dynamics and household welfare in the North. What are the key drivers of welfare in these contexts of violence? And finally, also how there are heterogeneous effects. In other words, how the results vary by area of residence, the gender of the household head, the age of the household head, and so forth. And the main contribution from this study that we've identified is that these different forms of insecurity, which I'll get to shortly, they impact poverty through varied and distinct pathways. But across this, as the Honorable Minister referenced, livelihood diversification is by far the most consistent resilience factor across the three northern zones. So to analyze the relationship between insecurity and welfare, this study relied on a range of data sources. So we relied on the relatively recent Nigeria Living Standards Survey, the Demographic and Health Survey. So since both surveys over the last couple of years, we combined this information with georeferenced data on conflict events and fatalities from the Armed Conflict Location and Event data. And then finally, on the qualitative side as well, we were able to, through a recent study also supported by FCDO, we were able to carry out in-depth interviews with people in and near poverty across the 6 geopolitical zones, but we reanalyzed those from the northern zones that where we'd interviewed people in and near poverty to understand pathways out of poverty, including in insecure contexts. We situated these within focus group discussions. We undertook key informant interviews and a set of group discussions as well in Borno, Benue, and Jigawa. What I'll present for brevity will focus especially on Borno and Benue contexts, given the links with heightened insecurity. So what did the results show? The results are that I'm presenting are divided by the three types of insecurities that our study speaks to. So in the Northeast, we focused especially on Boko Haram-related violence. In the Northwest, we focused especially on banditry. And in the North Central, we focused especially on farmer-herder conflicts. And this is because when you do look at the conflict, these types of insecurities across Nigeria over recent years, there is a spatial clustering of these conflicts within these zones. So starting with Boko Haram violence and its relationship with welfare, what we see is that Boko Haram violence, in terms of the numbers of people killed, in terms of the whether this is measured in very recent to the household survey, or if we look at the history of violence over the last 10 or 15 years, regardless of how we measure this violence, we see that Boko Haram violence has the most consistent depressing impacts on household welfare. So, for example, we see 8 to 14% lower expenditures per adults in households where Boko Haram events or fatalities occurred in the 2 years preceding the household survey. We also see conflict debt, so which is a measure of the intensity of violence over since the start of the violence. So since about 2009, in terms of Boko Haram violence, is also similarly associated with lower expenditure. So there's these long-term welfare impacts as well, in addition to these more recent continued depressing effects. In terms of farmer-herder violence, what we saw is that this violence, as literature points to as well, is seasonal and it's spatially concentrated. It does allow a degree of households recovery, but it doesn't do this in a sustained way. It prevents assets from being consolidated and developed over time because of this temporal element. It's seasonal. So households start to recover a bit, then the next intensities of violence increase during lean periods and brings them back down. So it's a series of ups and downs that households tend to experience. And what we see amongst violence related to farmer-herder conflicts is that it's households just above the poverty line, so non-poor but still vulnerable to poverty, who tend to be most vulnerable. So they are those who have, for example, some degree of farmland, they have crops, they have livestock to lose. And in these contexts of farmer-herder violence, they tend to be most severely affected. Now, the qualitative evidence really reinforces and extends some of these insights. So we saw, for example, in Benue, sites of farmer-herder conflicts, for example, we saw recurrent asset stripping, so of stripping of crops, livestock, farmland, as mentioned. We saw displacement. So as mentioned, it was one of interrupted recovery. Whereas in Borno, we saw a slightly different pathway where there was more heightened and prolonged displacement, which led to asset depletion, which led to severed access as well to land and markets amidst this displacement, and led to this formation of a garrison economy. And what we mean by garrison economy is that even where attacks are not constant, there's a fear of violence, which reduces farming and market engagement. So in this context, we see security perimeters in parts of the state, which contain economic actors, which restrict mobility, which severe access to farmlands elsewhere in the country and so forth. So it's this garrison economy as well, which we see operating, which then, as a result of displacement, leads to more chronic forms of poverty. And there was a range of dynamics also observed in IDP camps. Again, as mentioned, mobility restrictions, support being rooted through institutions or programs, degree of host and IDP tensions as well that we can revisit during the Q&A if of interest. Finally, with regards to banditry we saw in the quantitative analysis, we saw that it imposed, again, had depressing effects, but not just for near poor households, but also those who are moderately poor. So under the poverty line, not in extreme poverty, but in moderate poverty and just above. So those households around the poverty line. And in the qualitative data, what we saw is banditry being described quite regularly as constraints on productive activity. So this was through channels of cattle rustling, farm raids, kidnappings. It was linked very much to poverty and a limited alternatives And in fact, without these credible alternatives, what we see is that households are being trapped in low return survival strategies. Now, in the Northwest, there were some, and in North Central, where we also saw banditry, I should mention, in the qualitative data, we saw that there were some reconciliation efforts, but these reconciliation efforts tended to be less effective when livelihood alternatives were not part of the package. Instead, because these alternatives were not there, we often saw ex-combatants return to violence. We saw a reduction in trust in institutions, all which reinforced these survival strategies. So ultimately, then, briefly comparing across the three contexts, the three types of insecurities, just to summarize, Boko Haram, we saw some of the largest effect sizes in terms of its relationship with poverty and welfare, and being associated with lower welfare. Banditry tended to affect households in moderate poverty or near poverty, while farmer-herder violence erodes especially the welfare of those who are not in poverty but near the poverty line. And again, these effects are driven by types of violence and the types of localized economies that they may result in or amplify. Now, I'll end by noting that there are some cross-cutting dimensions to this, but then also it's not all a story of doom and gloom. There are some positives, pathways out of poverty also that we identified. But firstly, in terms of the cross-cutting components, displacement, we saw almost consistently across different types of insecurity, but the type of displacement varied. So in Borno, for example, we saw prolonged displacement in Benue, oscillating descents as a result of these seasonal variations in insecurity. We saw social and market disconnection, so host communities absorbing displaced households, straining their own livelihoods. But at the same time, without institutional support, households accruing exploitative debt, affecting their food insecurity as well. We saw intersecting crises. So yes, this is a story that we've communicated of conflict and violence, but it's also one where in the recent years we've seen price shocks, whether through the fuel subsidy removal, through inflation, and so forth. It's a context, as Dr. Okoha highlighted, around climate and environmental shocks as well. So floods, pest outbreaks, which pushes households again deeper into poverty or newly into poverty. We saw cross-cutting reflections around gendered responsibilities. So in these contexts of insecurity, women taking on increased care responsibilities, shifting to petty trade with less control over resources, the risk of violence as well, and sexual and gender-based forms of violence embedded in insurgencies as well. And in some cases, exploitation of these in humanitarian settings where, for example, access to aid was conditional on things including like sexual compliance. And as noted, there's also this other pathway that we've presented less on, but it's in the PowerPoint annexes of interest, which spoke to chronic poverty, unemployment, and education disruption as increasing people's exposure to violence as well. So very briefly then, in terms of what can support the maintenance of household welfare, or even surprisingly, support upward mobility in these contexts. A first key factor, as the Honorable Minister summarized, is that of livelihood diversification. So we looked at different types of livelihoods. We looked at farm-based livelihoods, off-farm, non-farm enterprise development, wage employment, and so forth. But it was really the combination of more than one of these livelihood types that was the most consistent protective factor in context of insecurity. At the same time, only 13% of household heads engaged in this livelihood diversification. So this is an area that we can think of how to better support households to enable their diversification, to better spread risk during these contexts. A second finding was around the role of education. There were some variations as noted by demographics, but overall, the completion of at least lower secondary levels by the household head was associated with higher expenditures across most of the welfare distribution for all insecurity types, for all three regions. So education as well, along with this livelihood diversification, are two key propellers of upward mobility in spite of conflict and insecurity. And then as the qualitative results also reinforced, there were a set of enablers for these drivers to be effective. So these enablers included things like social networks. There was a degree of gatekeeping as well with political links, links with chiefs or local authorities, mediating access as mentioned, IDP camps having access to certain services, though again with restricted opportunities. So there were restrictions to this. And then some degree of local mediation efforts, including around conflict resolutions, but as I noted before, some reconciliation failures too as well. So in short then, going forward, what the research points to, there's some gaps that we'd like to build on going forward. First, around more research at the state level into the drivers and consequences of banditry. From our qualitative data, there were some episodes of banditry we observed in the North Central, but our previous qualitative data collection in Jigawa meant that this was not a prime site of banditry events, so we were less able to draw on banditry-related livelihood trajectories and so forth. A second is around the interaction of conflict with environmental stressors and with economic instability, and how this shapes farmer-herder conflicts. As I noted, this is also related to all of this is related to, in different ways, to the geopolitics of mining as well. And a third area is around the relationship between sexual and gender-based violence and broader violent conflict, including on that positive slant, how women are able to strengthen their agency and contribute to conflict resolution and peace processes. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to the discussion ahead.
Thank you, Vidya. In 43 pages, you summarize so quickly and so eloquently. Thank you very much for this summary. We'd like to open the floor now. We don't have a lot of time, but we are hoping that we can take about 5 comments, observations, feedback, questions, and then those who are not able to get their questions and comments through, please put your observations in the chat, and we will be able to respond to you after the webinar. But for now, kindly put your hands up if you have an observation, a comment, a point of feedback, a request for clarification. We'd be happy to entertain that for just about 5 people. So do we have a hand up? Yes. All right. So the first hand, we just invite you to make your observation, your comment, or your question as brief as possible so that others will have an opportunity to also chime in, please. So over to you. Who is the person?
Hello, good morning.
Tijani. Oh, Tijani. Oh, okay. Yes.
Yeah, hello, good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Vidya, for the presentation. It's a very interesting research work. But I don't know whether I missed because I was trying to link up earlier before the network was not doing well before I joined late. So I don't know whether in the research you looked at the role of illegal mining activities in promoting most of this conflict in the north, especially in the northwest and in the northeast, because you could see that most times I think I've come across other research that speak to what illegal mining activities as part of the things that are promoting those conflicts in those areas. So I don't know whether your research had time to look deeply or a little bit into the activities of illegal mining operation in the north that is part of the drivers of the conflict in the northern Nigeria. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take a cluster of questions and we try to respond to all of them while others are in the chat for later response. So is there a second question? Thank you very much for that question, Madam Tijani. Ambassador Amicheu? Ambassador?
Yeah. Yes, ma. Can you hear me, doctor?
Yes. Good morning to you.
Good morning, ma. I want to start by appreciating dRPC for coming out to take this research. From us, from the civil society, we are part and process of the research, and we have contributed immensely toward reaching the affected population and getting the voice of the voiceless out in respect to this. And I believe this is going to contribute to the future policy decision and advocacy, of which I'm happy that the Honorable Minister is here, and we are hoping to see how we can be able to take our advocacy to him so that this finding can be implemented. It shouldn't be just in a paper, but to ensure that it is usually is utilized for the benefit of the citizenry. One advocacy I want to take to dRPC and relevant stakeholders on this is the need for us to, as recommended, to diversify this research. This was carried out in the Northeast only, and now the trajectory is now spreading, as we all know, to the Lake Chad. So for us to really understand the dynamic beyond the Northeast here, it will really contribute to the peace process and then the sustainable development that we are all envisaging. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and we're looking for more impact together. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, Ambassador Shehu. Is there a third hand up? Is there a third hand up? Yes, please, you've been given the permission to speak. Is it Prince Israel? Oh,
yes, Prince Israel Reka is my name, from Connected Advocacy. Thank you very much, Doctor. Thank you, dRPC. Thank you, Vidya. I don't know. You guys have done an amazing job. But I want to ask around the poverty circle around the Northeast. Now it's coming towards the entire country. How do we begin to see this research as an opportunity to actually advise government to open the space for job creation that will help reduce the level of insecurity? Because if these guys are engaged productively, just as it told in so many clans across the globe, they will not be thinking towards this other direction. So tackling poverty, I think, is another critical area that we must begin to look at too, because I remember then our late President Muhammadu Buhari said, if nothing is being done to tackle youth unemployment, it's going to be a catastrophe for this country. And today we are seeing a serious catastrophe, not only in the Northeast now, in the entire country. So when people are idle, the devil becomes their workshop. And when the workshop is there, how will they sustain it? So how do we begin to move towards this research? Because you guys did an amazing job to advise our government to begin to see tackling poverty as a priority, and it's part of the SDG goal. Doctor and the team, assalamu alaikum, I appreciate your work in depth, but let's see how we begin to push towards using this research to actually tackle the core issue, which is poverty. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you very much. Can we take one more comment or question or feedback on the study?
Hi, good morning. This is Nina from the British High Commission in Abuja, and I'd just like to say on behalf of the FCDO that we were very pleased to support this study under the SPRiNG program, and congratulations to dRPC, IDS, and CPAN for this excellent work. I think it's a really important study, and it contributes to the evidence around how deeply interconnected poverty, conflict, and humanitarian need are. So, which is something we all knew, but I think this study really helps draw out how different types of violence and insecurity have different impacts, rather than just treating conflict as a uniform shock that has uniform effects. So I think that's a very valuable contribution from this work. And linked to that is a question, actually. And I thought it was striking that the study showed that the Boko Haram insurgency had the largest impact on welfare and on poverty. And that to me suggests that it's the duration and the entrenchment of conflict as much as it's linked to the impact. And also the importance of acting early and acting before responding to the violence before it gets too entrenched. But I would like to hear if that's a reasonable interpretation, and if there are any other factors that you might cite as deepening the impact of the Boko Haram insurgency and its impact on welfare and livelihoods compared to the other forms of violence that you examined. Thank you.
So can we take, thank you for that. Can we just take one more question? Dr. Musa Umar? Professor Musa Umar?
Hello, thank you, Dr. Walker, and thank you, Via, for your precise presentation. I like the findings and all that been presented. Just a little comment about the Benway, the categorization of the conflict in Benway. Yes, of course, the conflict there is multidimensional, the crisis is multidimensional. And the most prominent is the farmer-herder conflict, as we do know. But there are other dimensions which I think the report tried to capture also. But I'm just worried about the categorization of making it farmer-herder, because I think a lot of debate about whether it's farmer-herders. And the conflict is no longer limited to traditional dispute between farmers and herders. Now it also involves armed militias, criminal gangs, bandits, banditry, so much proliferation of sophisticated weapons. So I don't know, I'm a bit concerned if the categorization for North Central will be limited to just farmer herders conflict, or maybe we'll find a better maybe concept to describe that. But so that we don't lose the essence of the dimension of the crisis there. So that's my point here. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Perhaps what we can do now is to ask all other participants, if you have questions or comments, simply put them in the chat and we would respond to them virtually. As regards the responses now, maybe what I can do is take a crack at some of the questions, and then Vidya would also chime in with regard to any areas that I've left out, or perhaps she has a fuller interpretation. Professor Musa, you've raised an issue that is in the 43-page paper, and it's addressed not as a limitation, but it's addressed as an issue, in the sense that we need classifications to be able to understand the phenomena. And yes, the North Central farmer-herder is not the only phenomena that drives conflict and insecurity. And the paper did recognize that there's a conflation of that, banditry and militia. But in terms of the essence, yes, that is what the focus was on. And you are actually raising an issue that we are seeing. And in fact, Prince Israel also spoke to that. The conflict is multiplying, it's taking different forms, and there are several points of intersectionality and overlaps. So, but for the purposes of research, some sort of order and form and the focus on the dominant manifestation of the conflict was critical and important, and this is what drove the analysis. So we take what you've said into consideration, and yes, you're quite right. It's not just one conflict. There are multiple conflicts and they're overlapping. But in terms of coming up with an essence of what is the dominant focal point and the key driver, that's what was classified for the North Central. Nonetheless, the point is well taken. In respect of illegal mining, this is really important in the sense that it wasn't a point of the study, but it was in the ecosystem. It was stumbled upon. It was said on several occasions, not just for the Northwest, but for the North Central. It was part of the ecosystem. It was a serendipitous finding. And very importantly, based on that, Vidya was able to capture that phenomena in another proposal for deeper research in the Northwest in particular, because the number of times it was said, the phenomena, and most importantly, the salience and the belief that this was in fact the driving force, and we need to be able to understand how it overlaps with banditry, that in fact we were told on several occasions that bandits are not just bandits, they are paid by miners. So it came out, but it wasn't the main focus and substance of the study. So it's there. By Prince Israel saying that insurgency, poverty, they are interacting, and in fact, what we do see it's proliferating across the country. Yes, there's data to that effect. We know that, we see it, and there is a hard data. What do we do about that? And your comment that we need to talk to the government, we need to make sure that policymakers are on board and understand the seriousness of the matter. And here you have your answer. The minister is on this particular webinar. And when we do our research, in fact, Vidya will share this with you, all the research that we've been doing with BASIC before the SPRiNG research, they've all been shared with the ministry. The ministry, we've had engagements, we've had discussions. The National Council on Humanitarian Affairs and Poverty Reduction, when it took place last year, one of the central points was the submission of memoranda. The dRPC submitted memoranda based on our research, and the research findings were incorporated into the minister's new response to humanitarian crisis and the impetus for reduction of poverty. So it is engagement, it is dissemination, it is sharing information, and this is the only way we can get the policymakers aware and using the information and ensure that there's uptake and responding to what we see as civil society on the ground as we do real-time research. So that is certainly an important point. Regarding the FCDO observation, and this is critical, in the Northeast, it's an issue of a length of the insurgency, is also scope of the insurgency. And on the issue of scope, I think this is what Ambassador Shehu was also referring to, that it's not just a Borno study, it's a zonal thing in the Northeast. And I think what I understand from him is that he's also talking about the Lake Chad Basin and the entire insecurity of that zone. So the scope matters. I know that we can make the same argument about the scope in the North Central, but it's a little bit different. But in terms of the Northeast, it's an issue of scope, and it's certainly an issue of the length of time. There are other factors. There's a critical factor. The Northeast also had a very long experience of banditry. Before the Boko Haram period, there was a whole period of bandits coming from Chad and from Mali and affecting the Northeast. So you have the movement and the transition from one type of insurgency and insecurity and destabilization into another type in the Northeast, but certainly length and scope across the Lake Chad Basin, those are critical factors, and that's a really important question. The question also, were there other factors? And the other part of the question is, does it speak to the issue of anticipating crisis and then reacting? Certainly, yes. And we've done, again, with FCDO support, a lot of research on anticipatory crisis and research on recommendations for proactive responses. So these are a few nuggets of responses. I hand over to Vidya, who I'm sure will fill it in more broadly. Thank you, Vidya. What did I leave out?
Thanks so much for your comprehensive reply, Judith Ann. Just to add very briefly, so I think Prince Israel had noted a point around opening the space for job creation. And indeed, some of the policy implications that our work speaks to is very much around this linking up security and conflict resolution responses with livelihood recovery interventions. So this could, and I think this speaks to Graham's point in the chat as well around what this research suggests for the One Humanitarian, One Poverty Reduction strategy framework. So this could be, for example, through local policing, conflict resolution, development coordination platforms at state level. It could involve linking security operations with agricultural recovery programs explicitly, disarmament initiatives being explicitly linked to vocational training programs. And as Judith Ann mentioned, not forgetting that anticipatory action component, whether in the conflict related to disasters. So in terms of the implications for this framework, I think we have a session coming up within this, a slot coming up within today's session about it, the policy implications, but it's really around this bringing centrally the livelihood recovery component within this humanitarian, one poverty reduction. For instance, is one side of the coin alongside there's a variety of other interventions that support poverty reduction. So recognizing the complementary factors to support poverty reduction in conflict-affected contexts is something that our study points to. Nina's comment around the Boko Haram insurgency having the largest impact, I think just to build on what Judith Ann was saying as well, or complement it rather, in many cases in the Northeast, we saw prolonged displacement, and so it really does speak to what you were suggesting. So there was less opportunity to rebuild assets. Market connections were weak. And with the local markets and economic activities being relatively weaker, that's then limited people's alternative livelihood opportunities and so forth. So it's that livelihood as well as insecurity affecting livelihoods and affecting the wider economic context that we identified to have especially depressing effects on welfare. I think in the chat, very briefly, Christine had a comment around organized crime being used as a survival strategy. And actually, I didn't speak to it in today's call, but in the webinar, but in the insights, for example, even from Jigawa, we saw respondents linking livelihood stress to rising petty crime, especially, and insecurity at the community levels. And they attributed this to livelihoods becoming difficult. They noted in one long-term resident interview in urban Jigawa, for example, they noted from 2023, to date, the rate of stealing has increased in this area, mostly at night, especially if it's raining. So petty crime, there was some evidence of that being used as a survival strategy. But going forward as well, this reverse relationship of poverty to insecurity is something that we would seek to build on, to build the evidence around. And then finally, there was a comment from the chat about how best to balance the nexus programming. But I think that speaks to what I was mentioning around the centrality of livelihood recovery, pro-poor livelihood-focused interventions within this nexus programming or the OHO-PRS framing more broadly. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vidya. Can we now move into the next segment of the program? We have several questions and Vidya has addressed many of them. If there are others, and we invite you to continue sharing, submitting questions, we would address them and respond. So thank you very much. I think this was an excellent session and we appreciate the level of engagement on the research findings. Thank you so much. We will now move into the discussion reflection session, and we'd like to invite Dr. Okoha to speak to some of the key nuggets of the report that perhaps aligns with the work of SPRiNG, or more broadly, some of the questions that were raised today, perhaps in terms of methodology, states covered, in terms of future directions. We invite you to talk to us about some of your reflections on the study. Thank you very much, Dr. Okoha.
Thank you very, very much. Am I being heard?
You are.
Yeah, thanks very much. Let me start by commenting on the study's engagement with the relationship between poverty and violent conflicts. The study provides data Sorry, are you hearing me?
Hearing you. We lost you
Hello?
for about over a minute.
Hello?
Yes, Doctor, we lost you for over a minute.
Okay,
Sorry.
let me start again.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry about that. It seems there's a net fluctuation in my network here. I was going to first speak on one of the study findings around the long-standing debates between the correlation of poverty and lack of welfare and livelihoods and the onset of conflict. And there is this interesting comparison between Kano and Benue State in terms of the level of poverty in the different ways it is described, as well as the onset of violence. So as we speak, there is a sense in which Kano is more stable and less violent, experience less violence than Benue. But just to say that from the work we do, that part of the reason why the complexity of this is the fact that beyond looking at the poverty index, we also need to look at other variables, the level of polarization in society, in the context being spoken about, the nature of elite consensus, and the way institutions are present, and even the history of management of conflict. So where there are traditional institutions for addressing this, then, and this is what we refer to as peace capacities, then it will not be the case that the presence of poverty would naturally lead to violence. So that is why the work we do in peace building is critical in the sense that, yes, there are deprivation, social inequalities, and poverty, but the presence of peace capacities, institutions that are there to manage grievance, to resolve disputes, is also equally very, very important. So it's just an important point to make, so addressing poverty is very, very important. Poverty is a major challenge. It makes people vulnerable to being mobilized. And it also, conflict itself, and again, another important contribution of this work, showing how prolonged conflicts and its impact affects livelihoods. And also, in that sense, elongates or prolongs the period of violence and its impact, because the more people remain in that circle, they become more vulnerable, they can be absorbed. So, and that is why in terms of post-conflict work, livelihood intervention is also very, very important. So in the SPRiNG program, as we speak, beyond therefore working as part of building capacities for peace, we are also helping conflict-affected communities assess skills, assess finance through economic empowerment initiative, because we think that this would help to build resilience as well. And from the point of view of this as well, I mentioned earlier our interest in climate resilience, but also even in terms of coping capacities, utilization of the natural environment and natural resource, we've seen that also poverty and lack exposes individuals, households, and communities to adopting negative coping capacities that undermine further degrades the environment, depletes resources, and also creates this vicious circle where, in trying to cope in the absence of resources, they undermine the environment, they violate even traditional conservation methods that existed, and so make coping difficult, and then intensify resource competition that also now, in a complex of different ethnicities, bringing the conflict cycle again. So that is something that, this really brings back to the center stage the need to really address livelihood issues, welfare issues in public policy and programming if we are going to have more stable communities. And I think that this study helps to, policymakers and those of us involved in programming on peace building to really factor this in the work we do. So yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Okoha.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, and thank you especially for bringing in the component and reminding us about the component of peace building. And this is really critical, and we thank you for this. It links well. The thread runs across what we have found, and it links well as a response. Thank you very much for this. We'd like to call on the Honorable Minister to give his reflections also, as he indicated he's at a meeting right now, yet he left the meeting and he stayed with us for an hour, but unfortunately he has to return to another session which he's leading. But he requests very kindly to be able to give his summative reflections of what he has heard, what he has read, and what he will take forward. So, Honorable Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and apologies to those that I think I have another session that I'll be missing, but I thought I'll need to give my final reflection. Interesting discussion, and the energy in the room is really great, and I appreciate that. Just to say that the government is committed to adopting recommendations aimed at improving our systems and programs, and so we will work closely with dRPC and all other stakeholders to ensure that this is the case. From the findings, it is clear that we need to work closely with the country's security systems because we need to collaboratively win. This is important because our investment in poverty reduction and social protection should deliver long-term outcomes. And I hear Ambassador Shehu and the civil society voices. I have an open door policy, and we'll be happy to hear more from the civil society. Happy to engage anytime. Winning the war against poverty and reducing humanitarian crisis in Nigeria is a collective responsibility. Every one of us is needed to join hands together so that we can all win together. And as mentioned in my earlier, my opening statements, the One Humanitarian, One Poverty Response System is an architecture that brings all stakeholders, partners, governments at the subnational level together so we can all work closely to remove duplication. As we close today's session, I want to return to where we began. We opened by naming mutation as the disease afflicting our humanitarian and development architecture. And over these discussions, the SPRiNG program's evidence from Borno, Benue, and Jigawa has shown us in granular detail exactly what that fragmentation caused. With conflict and poverty feed one another in vicious cycle. How livelihood diversification stands out as the most reliable path to resilience, and how education protects some households while structural barriers shut others, particularly women-headed and youth-headed households. Out of its benefits entirely, we cannot say we did not know. The evidence has been placed squarely in front of us. That is the standard against which one humanitarian, one poverty response system must now be judged. One system, one register, one will. It's not a slogan we repeat. It is a commitment we must operationalize, state by state, household by household. The findings shared today should not sit in a report. They should shape how we sequence relief and recovery in Borno, how we target by conflict, death, and deprivation in the unified register, and how we design graduation pathways will reach women and youth rather than bypassing them. I am encouraged by the argument in this room. Researchers, development partners, subnational actors, and ministries have spoken today with a shared vocabulary and a shared sense of urgency. That alignment is the whole of government, whole of society response, and that is what OHOPRS demands. And it must not end when we leave this session. I therefore ask each of you to carry forward 3 commitments. First, to integrate the conflict and poverty data presented today into how your institutions target and sequence support. Second, to hold OHOPRS accountable to outcomes, households exiting poverty rather than input distributed. And third, to ensure that the equity gaps research has exposed, particularly for women and youth, are addressed by design in every program we build under this framework. Our mandate is no longer to manage poverty. It is to end it. Let us leave this room and begin that work. Thank you all for your time, your insights, and your partnership. I must leave you now, but I'm sure we will engage further.
Honorable Minister, thank you. You have opened the door for more communication from this project to your office.
Yes.
We will be in touch. Thank you very much. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you. Thank you.
So on that note, we'd like to call on Dr. Julie Sander, the Director General of the Plateau State Peacebuilding Agency, to give her reflections on the research findings and the report. Dr. Julie Sander.
Thank you, Judith, and I apologize for joining a bit late, but I did get, some of the presentation of the research. I'd just like to make a few comments based on, the work we do and what we've seen, basically to underscore the point that it's a very important work that you've done. From the perspective of integration, in our peace building work, and Ukoha alluded to this, peace building remains very important for us in conflict settings, but then, the intersectionality of the issues is something that we have come to grapple with, and to see firsthand because of the issues that have been discussed, prolonged conflict and the after effects, of course. For us here, mass displacements, prolonged displacements, these are things that, compromise or deepen the vulnerability of people affected by conflict to be able to, to restart their lives and to regain their lives. And so for us early on in this assignment, we found that we could talk about peace without integrating or, looking at the intersectionality with issues of livelihoods, because those compromised, people no longer have access to their lands, for those who are farming, livelihoods are being destroyed, whether it is livestock, it is farms, it is even your marketplaces and so on. And so, like I said, it increases the vulnerability of people and it complicates our peace building work, in so many ways. Because you're talking social cohesion, you're talking dialogue, you're talking mediation. People are like, what about our livelihoods? After the dialogue, then what? So along the way, like I said, we began then to adopt a humanitarian development peace building nexus approach to looking at the issues that we're dealing with. And, as a framework to dealing with some of those issues. Now, while as a peace building agency, we are not in a position to deal with all of those other sectors, we're not a development, organization, but at least having that perspective helps us now to be able to look out for, or to work with partners who do that kind of work and to join forces with us. Also on the humanitarian side, to be able to work closely, with humanitarian actors, to work or sometimes actually to integrate our approaches and our engagements. And one particular one was the one we were able to do last year with the humanitarian department in ECOWAS, of course, working through our humanitarian ministry, where we're able to develop, to deliver on a support to women-led households and to children affected by conflicts. And that greatly boosted work we do is communities. Particular focus for us then is children. In the course of delivering on that engagement, we saw firsthand the huge problem we have with children out of school coming directly out of displacements. But out of that particular project, we were able to get scholarships, to send children back into school, or to get children who were writing exams to complete their exams and so on. And so for us, it's very significant. We were able to get about 500 children, back in school with that engagement, also deliver some livelihood support to women-headed households and so on. Now that's one engagement. We're just scratching the surface. But I'm using that example to say it is something we have seen, a need we have seen. It is a work we have engaged in, and we need to be able to take it forward. So, with everything you've said and with the minister's response, I think if we're able to gain traction, we will gain impact, make more impact on that. Some of the work that Ukoha referred to, in terms of working with communities in livelihood areas, we partnered with some of those organizations here on the plateau in the specific context, of course, of climate smart agriculture, or just working with people in communities where there were farmers and there were those who were herding, to be able to come into some kind of symbiotic relationship. So we brought a peace building perspective to it and all of that. So some of those things are going on, but we need, and they're scalable. So this is where my point is, that we need to scale up some of these. Perhaps we need a little bit more research that will, to give us some nuanced context, particularly here on the plateau, and then to be able to scale up. And I'm so happy that, we have a minister who is really engaged, with the issues, and not just from, the practical issues, but even the research, the evidence that is coming from the field. So I'm hopeful, that going forward, we should be able to see, concrete support and engagement from the federal level, engaging, of course, with the subnationals and down to the communities. So thank you for this opportunity, Judith. Great work. We look forward to more.
Dr. Samuel, thank you so much. Thank you very much. You have brought in the perspective that Okoa alluded to regarding the peace building nexus. You have raised the issue of education. You have raised the issue of economic diversification and household livelihoods in the context of peace building, and perhaps in anathema to peace building. How do you do both at the same time? And this is really, really an important dimension. Thank you very much. You've built on what Okoha discussed. Thank you very much. This is really, I don't think it's restricted to the North Central. I think it's the whole nexus in all the zones that we are talking about, North Central, Northeast, and Northwest. This is really very welcome. Thank you for making the time. I know that you're on a retreat right now and that you've made the time. Thank you very much again. So now we'd like to ask Professor Bemisola. He's the director of the Center for Peace and Strategic Studies, University of Ilorin, to reflect on what he's heard, to reflect on the paper which he has read, and to share with us some of his insights as an academic and also someone in the, I would say, North Central region who has been seeing how these issues are evolving in the zone. Thank you, Prof.
Yeah, good morning. Am I audible, please?
Yes, you are. You are.
Okay. It is a privilege for me to be here, and I want to adopt the existing protocols. For me, I consider being here an opportunity to lend my voice to a very timely study. I want to state here that I'm here this morning, not just as a discussant, but as a scholar whose entire career has been at the intersection of violence, governance, and the survival of everyday Nigerians. This is what this study focuses on, and that is why I want to commend Walker, and Abdulrazak for the excellent work they have done, because I'm a student of violence and insecurity, and I can boldly say that as of today, there's no work of this nature on any shelf. So to that extent, I would like to commend, commend the trio for the work they've done. Significantly, I found some of the figures here quite disturbing, and I think everybody should be worried that we have 125.8 million as at 2023. We've had almost 12,000 conflict fatalities in 2024 alone. And now, in the early days of Boko Haram, we had the Bay states, that is Borno, Adamawa, and Yobe, as the epicenter of Boko Haram violence. But this study has revealed to us that now we have a cartography of conflict fatalities in Nigeria. When you look at the figures from Borno, Zamfara, Katsina, and Benue states. So for me, this is not just, these are not mere figures. These are revelations that should, disturb an average person. So I go on to discuss some of the specific findings from the study. And the first one for me here is the nuanced typology of conflicts that the work has provided. Oftentimes, violence, insecurity are rarely nuanced in Nigeria. And I think that has also made responses, inadequate and, mismatching the responses they ought to provide. So the work stands out uniquely by giving us a nuanced breakdown of the typology of conflicts in Nigeria, Boko Haram insurgency, banditry in the Northwest, and other violence. All of these this entire breakdown is important because it will aid responses to be tailored, and it will also provide basis for what we in academics call grounded theories. The second interesting finding here for me is the garrison economy. The report shows that, the productive hinterlands have been severed, markets have become stagnant, communities are held hostage within illicitly governed spaces. And I would like to say here that it's important we acknowledge that. So I personally, I reject the description of such spaces as ungoverned. I will rather prefer they are acknowledged as illicitly governed spaces because nature abhors vacuum. And what is clear in many of these places is that there has been either a sacking of the state or an abdication of state's responsibilities. So this gives us an analytical that one of this is that the garrison economy is not only a consequence of violence, it is partly a product of governance failure that preceded it. The one response agenda must ask who benefits from this market stagnation. Until the political economy of the garrison is mapped, humanitarian interventions risk being absorbed to the structures that produced the crisis. The third finding, which also resonated with me, is the targets of the bandits. The data from the study has revealed to us that the main targets of bandits attacks are not the lumpen proletariat, as Karl Marx described them. The very poor. Rather, the bandits deliberately target the near poor. And you can see this in Zamfara and Katsina in particular. This does not simply impoverish the victims, it destroys their asset building trajectory entirely. What are the policy implications of this? This tells us that targeting instruments, including socio-economic interventions, should not just address only the bottom quintile, but also the near what those you may call the middle class, because in Kwara states, especially in the Kwara South the senatorial districts, where banditry is also becoming an issue. My studies have shown that bandits deliberately target this kind of families, realizing that many of them have children, kindred abroad or in Lagos and Abuja who can quickly, set up WhatsApp groups to raise 5, 10, 20 million naira, which the very poor would not be able to, to do anyway. So it's important for us to appreciate them for bringing this to the fore. Now, the fourth finding I found interesting is the seasonal cycle of the farmer-elder violence, which we are yet to see our responses being attuned to. The work has shown us that there's a kind of a cycle for this kind of violence. And that is why sometimes policymakers may not appreciate the seriousness of this problem, because today the communities are sacked. Next farming season, the communities are alive again. So this work has shown us that cycle of emergency. That is when the conflict peaks, leading to displacement. Then the return. That is when assets are stripped and short, respite for the people. And unfortunately, that is when we now have the governments often trying to, sometimes even doing nothing, but that the study of this nature has brought this to the fore is worthy of commendation and attention by policymakers and program actors.
Professor Bamisola, I get a sense that you are pointing to the need for us to do some ethnographic or sociological studies on banditry to complement what we have done in respect of a more technical piece, looking at the economics and the political economy and the security dimension, but you're alluding to ethnographic and sociological issues relating to banditry. Very interesting, and thank you very much, Professor Bamisola. This is quite an exposition. We'd now like to move on to reflective peace with a difference. We'd like to ask or bring NASCO into the room, given the efforts and the achievements to date with regard to the review and updating of the National Social Protection Policy. We'd like to ask Mr. Mohammed Diko Bala, the head of the National Social Register, to reflect on the conversations and the report, of course, and to share with us any implications for NASCO for the process of perfecting and finalizing the policy, which I believe is almost completed, or for the work in general as NASCO operationalizes its work. Dr. or Mr. Bala, please, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. And can you see? Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you very much, and good day, everything. Well, I have followed up the conversation, and thank you very much, Lydia, for the wonderful presentation. To me, it has cost across shock response, multidimensional poverty, and even to some extent, the income poverty. However, as we reflect on I want to be specific on the policy. As we speak now, there is an ongoing discussion, technical in-house is going on with the social policy. I just like Honorable Minister said, to say our issue, the reflection, the integration, fragmentation. For years, we have run parallel programs with parallel systems, and the implication is clear. The reverse social protection policy, as they review it now, must institutionalize coordination. NASCO's role as the role in the NSR data is to ensure the quality assurance, to give technical support, and then interoperability can't be optional in the social protection policy. So because we have to reduce as much as possible the fragmentation, so interoperability can't be an option. So just like what the Honorable Minister, we are looking toward one registry, shared data, shared standard, and if we don't fix the pipes, even good programs will leak. And then secondly, I like to look at the, finance, financing social protection. Finance must match ambition. The policy sets bold goals and coverage and adequacy, but policy without budget is just a wish list. And then the reverse social policy needs ring fence financing lines, clarity and realistic cost, and then cost sharing between federal government, states, and donor and development partners. That's not generous, that is operational realism. And then third is the issue of ownership and perception at the subnational level. Whatever we do, if there is no ownership at the subnational level, particularly the states and the local government, because today the local government have been given their autonomy. So we should at least carry them along in terms of ownership, and then change their perception of how they deliver social protection. To my understanding, states deliver social protection quite all right, but too many still see it as a federal project or a humanitarian handout. The implication, the social protection policy must mandate state social policies and shift the narrative. Social protection is not charity. It is investment in shock relief. That 3 points, which are integration over fragmentation, and then finance must match.
Is he muted? Mr. Bala, have we lost you? Okay, you're muted. Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah. Thank you. So on a final note, I said I want to review. The reflection is on 3 items. First is the integration over fragmentation, and then second is finance must match ambition, and then the third one is ownership and perception of social protection at the subnational level, both the states and the local government. As a reflection, a policy document is just a paper until implementation architecture catches up. If this revision gives us stronger coordination, realistic financing, and true state ownership, then Nigeria's social protection policy moves from aspiration to impact. Therefore, this dialogue comes at a critical moment as Nigeria advances reforms aimed at strengthening coordination across humanitarian assistance, social protection, and poverty reduction systems, including the implementation of one humanitarian, one poverty response system, and related social protection initiatives. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bala. You have brought us back to reality that a policy, though important, is not an end in itself. It must be well-financed, operationalized, and operationalized all the way down to the local government level. This is a very important takeaway for us, and we thank you very much for that, because we can put all our emphasis on the need to ensure that the policy is completed and launched. And as you said, this cannot be an end in itself. We appreciate that reminder. And on that note, I would like to move on to the final takeaway and perhaps rounding up of the conversations of the morning. In doing so, there's one particular contributor who was not with us this morning, or who was with us and could not speak. We would like to give him a bit of time just to share with us some of the thinking of the Office of the SSA to the President on chieftaincy affairs in terms of how the role traditional and religious leaders can play in mitigating violence, in building peace in Nigeria. And of course, we all remember that 2 days ago, there was a national committee meeting on the role of traditional leaders on peace building in Jigawa State. So it's in line with that. Let's talk. We have been talking a lot this morning about peace building. Let's hear a bit more from the Office of the SSA to the President on traditional leaders and chieftaincy matters, please.
Good morning, all. Good morning, all.
Good morning, Alhaji Waziri.
Okay, let me, because of time factor, also write on the existing protocol. The problem, not only in northern Nigeria, Nigeria is being bedeviled by intersection of insecurity, poverty, displacement, mistrust, and weakened community resilience. These challenges bedeviling this country are reinforced by one another. Hence, the issue of what is happening in terms of insecurity, this and that, and whatever challenges we talk of, gender-based violence, social protection, poverty ending, and what have you, the most important aspect of tackling the issue of insecurity. All these government and development partners can be injecting a lot of money on it, but without security, there would never be the end of the problem. So hence, I intend to talk on the issue of insecurity as it affects the role of traditional rulers in peace building and development. Traditional rulers or leaders remain among the most trusted, accessible, and influential institutions in a community, institutions at community level. In many parts of the country, they are the first point of contact in terms of tension, conflict, or social disruption. So you could see, without them, I know the person at the rural level only knows his warhead. He reports whatever, whether security problem, whether the need for developmental project, he reports directly to the warhead reports to the village head reports to the district head, and then finally to their emir or chief. And the trial is so regimental, like the military. Reports easily get out. So we are not saying traditional rulers will be asked to go and fight. Reports getting is easier collated and submitted to the security agencies by the traditional institutions. Unfortunately, sometimes you find that things happen. People will say the traditional rulers in the area will be held responsible. How do you hold somebody responsible when you don't give him authority? He's not part of it. He's not being, and even if what is given to him and he sends, nobody, bandits can kill him or maim him. So these are some of the issues that need to be tackled. Slide.
I'm sorry, are you?
I'm on.
Oh, you're still on, okay.
Yes.
Oh, thank you very much, you are done. So thank you for...
I know I'm not done. I'm not done. I'm
but
on.
You're almost done. You're almost done. You're winding up.
Almost. Okay.
Okay. Just 1 or 2 minutes or 1 minute.
Okay. So there should be some role for in security and social stability. Intelligence gathering at the grassroots level, countering extremism and criminality, youth engagement and mentorship, promotion of agriculture and local enterprises, encouraging investments, facilitating access to land and community resources, supporting tourism and culture. Erosion of traditional values are the challenges facing traditional rulers. Political interference, inadequate resources, rapid urbanization, and social change. Like the farmer had a crisis. This issue of rapid change. All the cattle route in Nigeria, grazing routes, have been changed to, have been converted to highways. As such, that is why you find farmers move their cattle on the main road, and then they slip into the farm and eat the crops there. So there is the need to strengthen traditional institutions in terms of legal support policy. There is the need for capacity building, enhance collaboration with government agencies. That is, there is the need for synergy between traditional rulers and all agencies of government, and then government at the 3-tier level. Then we opt to have, I said, including in peace and development frameworks. When it comes to even the political insurgency, traditional institutions can play a very important role. They know these people. As a ward or village head, you know those in your community, you know those that are bound to create problem. You sit with them, you organize, you inform the security agencies, watch out on this, and then there will be no more or minimal political crisis, especially with the approach of the 2027 general elections. Hence, the need for, I urge on all and sundry to know that the office of the SSA is wanting to organize a capacity building for traditional rulers across board from all the states of the Federation, which will be held in Abuja or any other place. And then such training will be cascaded down up to the least level of traditional institutions. Because of the time factor, I would say thank you so much and God bless.
Thank you very much, Alhaji Waziri. And you have brought in a component of the ecosystem that we are aware of, that we took cognizance of in our research, but you've brought it more frontally for us to engage. That is the role of the chiefs and the religious and the traditional leaders in contributing to peace and, of course, security of communities at the very local level. So we appreciate your contribution. And if you don't mind, perhaps we can share your contacts with others on this webinar who may wish to engage with the Office of the SSA to the President on traditional leaders and chieftaincy matters. We thank you again. So as we enter the last component, the last stage of this important and I think very incisive webinar, we would just like to call on Vidya to give a few remarks, comments. What have you seen? What have you heard? And your general feedback about the significance of the research that we produce and perhaps the future of uptake in the policy space. Vidya.
Thank you. And it's been such an enriching discussion with such a great set of speakers and discussants. So thank you as well to all who have intervened, whether through questions or comments and reflections. I'll briefly just share two concluding remarks related to the policy implications of the work. You'll be able to find the policy implications in more detail in the forthcoming policy brief, but also just sharing this slide which summarizes it. And I'm not going to go through this. There's a wealth of information here, but just to focus on two including implications. And first is that recognition, which, for example, Bala from NASCO highlighted, and just now Abawada Wazir's interventions also spoke to, which is that Northeast, North Central, and Northwest zones really do require differentiated mixes of humanitarian relief, of social protection, and of livelihoods under the One Humanitarian, One Poverty reduction system. And here we've made some suggestions around the need to prioritize, for example, LGAs with high long-term histories of violence, as well as high poverty, for more concentrated supports, and really to help ensure that interventions is grounded in previous histories as well as long-term plans, as the Honorable Minister noted. And a second and final reflection is, I think all speakers variably referenced the need to build this importance of livelihood recovery, the need to support households to build multiple income streams rather than a single livelihood, especially as they're attempting to improve their welfare. This is a coordination that Julie Sanda from Plateau State also outlined. Even if the focus is coming from Peacebuilding, to identify the actors that are working on those livelihood components and the sectoral support for this that could enable this livelihood diversification. So things like expanding basic financial services in conflict-affected LGAs as a foundation for diversification, the importance of safe school measures as well, and SGBV violence prevention or response within these social protection and humanitarian packages. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all. I think that's the key takeaway, that this regionally differentiated, demographically differentiated understanding of welfare amidst crises and conflict especially has highlighted. But it is one that with the spread of minds here today and the spread of backgrounds, ministries, agencies, and representatives being on this call, that we could collectively take forward to create new and sustained inroads to support poverty reduction in a long-term manner. Thank you.
This is a wrap, and it's a very good point at which to end. But as we do, we'd like to call on Graham Gass, the Senior Social Development Advisor of FCDO, to just give us a few final reflections. Graham Gass. I think he's left us. Is Nina still with us? No. Nina has also left. So on this note, I think we have the reflections of Vidya, and we have a lot of future leaning recommendations and insights to reflect on. But we started on the note of absence or to remove fragmentation, or the need to harmonize and not to have too fragmented a space. Perhaps we can end on that with one final note. As we are talking about social protection policies, initiatives, the need for peace building, to avoid fragmentation, we should also keep our eyes on what the National Assembly is doing. There are lots of bills that are being proposed and discussed, some of them reaching second readings, that have direct implications for social protection, poverty reduction, that have very little linkage to what the executive is proposing in policies. As stakeholders in this space, I think many of us are not paying enough attention. For example, the National Social Welfare Service bill that is being proposed, and it's moving fast, and several other amendments to NEMA, and several other, in fact, we are tracking them, and we have a list about 8 or 9 of them. I think it's for harmonization and avoidance of fragmentation. The stakeholders in this space should keep their eye on some of these policies, some of these laws that are perhaps going a different direction to the policies that are being finalized at this point in time or being implemented. So on that note, on the note of avoidance of fragmentation, which is a note we started on, we'd like to thank everyone on this webinar this morning for making the time to be with us, to reflect, to discuss, to share insights. This has been very useful, helpful to us as researchers, and we would like to thank you again for making the time. Thank you very much. And we will share responses to the questions that were raised. And for those of you who would like to be in contact with others who were on this webinar, we'll be happy to share their contacts once they have approved. Thank you again. Good morning. Thank you.